On the road, in the gym, at a coffee house. No matter where you listen, this is Prevention Perk. I'm Steve Miller with Mid-America PTTC. It's time to perk up our prevention efforts. My guest today is Stephanie Ahles, the co-founder and CEO of EmpoweringYOU. She is an expert in effectively leading and managing organizations with a facilitative leadership style that prioritizes collaboration and inclusivity. Stephanie's expertise extends to participatory engagement methods and is certified as a technology of participation, top facilitator, and mentor trainer. With over 20 years of experience in county government, Stephanie specializes in leadership and organizational development, change and project management, along with strategic planning. Hello, Stephanie, and welcome to Prevention Perk.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me today.
It's good to have you here. I'm looking forward to this conversation simply because the work that you do is so empowering, and I think the audience will resonate with what we're going to unpack here today. And usually my first question is about the guests' participation in the prevention industry or how they got into the prevention industry. You're not a preventionist per se, but you found yourself kind of in this role, and we'll talk about how you're really fleshing out your skills and expertise, primarily in the state of Missouri. But how did you even get introduced into the prevention world?
I got introduced into the prevention world actually kind of as through my expertise around facilitation. So I was joined a colleague who was steeped in the prevention world and asked me to partner with her to come and do some projects. Was introduced to the PTTC and met Dave Clausen and just started to build a relationship with the PTTC and understanding a connection that I didn't know I had. So in my previous life, working in county government, I spent time working in treatment and really recognizing that treatment was the start of a new beginning for people, which really is where the prevention starts again in the cycle. And so although I was introduced to prevention through a colleague and through facilitation expertise, I realized that I've had a prevention kind of framework and lens for years.
You're listening to Prevention Perk. The funder of this project, along with all the other products of the Mid-America PTTC, is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Although funded by SAMHSA, the content of this recording does not necessarily reflect the views of SAMHSA. Community engagement, an essential component of an effective and equitable substance use prevention system, is a guide which reviews evidence related to leveraging community engagement to support the implementation and scale up evidence-based programs and policies. A link to this resource is available in our show notes. You were introduced to the Mid-America PTTC primarily when Dave Clausen was here. And I remember the first time I probably crossed paths with you, and would have been in the virtual space. A lot of the work that you were doing in the beginning was how to get people engaged in the virtual space, because it kind of all came together around the pandemic. And so it was about how to take what everyone was doing in prevention or in community type collaborative work and move it to a virtual world. And so that's kind of maybe where I first crossed paths with you. But talk a little bit about some of the things that maybe you did, and that maybe it might spark some memories for the listeners that you did with the PTTC early on.
Yeah, so some of the work with the PTTC was working in that virtual space and helping people understand how do you engage coalition members, community members, in what feels like a postage stamp, what feels like a space where engagement can't happen, and that projects feels like they're getting stalled. So working with people to help, one, show them how it's possible, two, encourage them that it is possible. So some of that was there. Then we started working with some of the boards, doing some work with the DEA, doing some work with ATTC and MTTC, just kind of engaging in any platform, doing some strategic planning work, doing some board development work, helping flesh out action plans or operational plans for the intersection between ATTC, MHTC, is that what it is?
MHTTC, yeah, mental health.
MHTTC, yeah, and the PTTC. So kind of how did we help them figure out where their collaboration points were, where were their intersections, and how did they create a plan to work better together? So some of the work that I did was all around, it didn't have to do with my expertise in prevention at all. I kind of look at myself as the expert in the process. So I bring the process and people bring their areas of expertise. So working with different coalitions and organizations, but bringing people together to do, I mean, we're better together, quite frankly. I think that was coined by Dave Clawson, which is we are better together. And I really believe that that's what I bring is processes to help people do that.
You know, I was sitting here thinking as she was talking about that the project I want to spend some time exploring is in the state of Missouri. And do you realize that's been right at about 2 years ago that we started this conversation? It was Kimberly Freeze from SAMHSA that approached me first of all and said, hey, what do you think about doing something in the state of Missouri that would bring together two different government entities, the DHSS and the mental health and the Department of Behavioral Health and Mental Health, and work towards addressing the opioid epidemic, but primarily a focus on overdose reduction, overdose prevention. And so Kim said, do you think you get Stephanie to come and do this? And I said, oh, I think Stephanie would love doing this. So can you kind of help us unpack exactly what that Missouri Overdose Prevention Project has been like?
Yeah, it has been and is an amazing project. What the investment that Missouri has put into saving lives across Missouri is incredible in my experience. But coming together, we brought 100+ people together from all different sectors, people from high political positions to community and members to people with lived experience. And we put everybody in a room together for 2 days to really identify the strategic plan that was going to help impact lives over the next 3 to 5 years. And that experience was fantastic. Just having everybody together, having the conversations flow, having people realize that how they were doing things might have been different, but their end goal of where they wanted to be and what they wanted for the health of Missouri was very similar. One really pivotal moment in that plan was in the morning of the second day when people started to trust each other. They started to understand that they saw things differently, but all felt like they were supported by each other in their vision. And we had a participant who kind of used her voice to say, and there's some inequities going on here. And are we really lifting people up the way that we need to for them to be successful? Or are we just kind of going through the motions? And it was a complete game changer for the whole experience. And people got to open their eyes for the first time that helping people survive is not enough. That we need to, as a state, and I say we as part of the facilitation team, but what the state of Missouri needs to not help people survive, but they need to help people thrive. And that has been their focus ever since that moment. It had changed what it is, how they looked at the plan, the actions that got placed on the plan. And so ever since then, they have been really looking in an innovative, creative way to help people not just get information, but internalize how to use the information, what to do with it, how to help people really make the changes that they want to make for themselves as it relates to the opioid crisis.
What was interesting is you kind of talk about that pivotal moment, and I was there in the audience actually observing this, and it was very powerful. I mean, it was palpable. You could feel it in the air when everybody kind of shifted, and it was like if we'd been around a campfire and everybody just started singing Kumbaya. It was like they all just came together, and it was really empowering. Then we fast forward, and it was about 1.5 years into the project, and they wanted to reconvene, and there were people that came to that get together that I think came to see and check in about what happened before, and was it time for them to really jump in and be involved in this process? I.e., to say, is there really engagement going on here? Did you kind of pick up on that? That it was like, we really want to do this, but we've heard that maybe it's not ready to really move forward, but they found out differently.
You know, Steve, that is something that is pretty standard across anytime you get a strategic plan put in place. Traditionally, some plans don't always stick. They might be a flavor of the moment or a flavor of the day. They might have the best intentions, but they find stuck points and they can't move forward. So yes, it's very common that people get on board, they get really excited, and then they drift away and they drift off to see if is the plan really going to happen. And so the state of Missouri did bring us back. You and I went back and we facilitated that 18-month check-in. And people did show up, and everybody was amazed at the work that had been done, how much work had been done over 18 months. Some of it was related directly to the strategic plan, and some of it was just because the conversations in that room changed the way that they thought about things, the way they went back to their specific organizations and did the work. And then recognizing at that 18-month check-in that everything they had done in all of those ways contributed directly back to the strategy areas that had been identified. So it was a real energizing moment for people to realize that not only is this plan still up and running, it's moving and it's catapulting into the future because so many people have changed the way they think or talk about the success of survivors.
Now, you talked about the individual who kind of in the very first convening said, is this really equitable? Are you really reaching the right audience with this? And so one of the things that came out of it, and again, I've been more of an observer through this process, and it's been really fun to kind of be a fly on the wall. I have been able to be involved in some measure, but where it fast forwarded to is just recently, we did a tour, I guess you could say, across the state of Missouri for a series of community listening sessions. And the places that we ended up with or ended up at basically says, yeah, we're making this or striving to make this as accessible and equitable as we possibly can. Can you talk a little bit about what that process looked like and some of the places that we actually got to engage in, the audiences we engaged with?
Yeah, so we were approached again by the state of Missouri to say we need some listening sessions. We really need to get boots on the ground and talk to people across the state, not just people that we're pulling together into one city and asking them to travel, but we need to go to them. And they also wanted to be a part of the process, but they didn't want anybody to feel like they were driving what the messages were. So they asked us to facilitate that for them. So it was a fantastic opportunity. We started our journey in St. Louis, where they put us in the community at a church. They put us at, oh my gosh, Steve, help me with the name of the church.
Jubilee.
Jubilee, that's right. And what was really interesting is when the pastor was talking about the church and the location and what they do, he referenced that the church is in the middle of Murder Mile, meaning the most murderous mile in a city across the United States. And I thought, wow, what a great organization. Jubilee Church just cares about their community, cares about the people. They've implemented a treatment program. They are starting to create outreach programs. There are so many things are going on because they want to make a difference in that area. So that is where we went, and we didn't know what to expect. We didn't know how many people were going to show up. There was no RSVP. It was just communicated out to community organizations, to people across the state. Anybody was welcome to attend. And Steve, they just kept coming. People just kept showing up. And at the end, we had over 70 people in that room that were talking about what is needed. We looked at a past, present, and future lens. What are things that have worked? What hasn't worked? What are some strengths that are going towards addressing this overdose crisis right now? What are some things that are really getting in our way? And what are some opportunities for the future? All leading up to recommendations for the state of Missouri for them to take a look at that 18-month plan created the next 12 months of activities. But they're going to use this information, these recommendations, to take a look and say, are we on track? Are we doing the right thing? Do we need to shift what the goals are that we've identified to make sure that they're meeting the needs of our community? So that was the first one. And we kicked that off in St. Louis, which was just amazing opportunity. From there, we went down to Poplar Bluff. I've a very small area in, I think it's southeastern Missouri. And there we worked actually within a probation department that had a connected treatment center. It was a smaller group, but it's a smaller community. And here again, we had an open invitation, and we had a few people in there. We had some staff in there, and we had a couple people with treatment in there. And people were coming and going through this probation office. And little by little, people kept finding their way to the conversation. They were listening at the door, and then we would invite them in. People were hanging out just to hear what was being said. And by the end of it, we had over 20 people, and about half of them were people with lived experience, either in treatment or not currently in treatment. And then those that were working with these individuals. And the realization at the end of that conversation was that that was the first time that everybody had really communicated on a level playing field, and that people were heard and listened to about what is truly important. One of the big aha moments was when people with lived experience said, we don't overdose on an 8 to 5 schedule. So the fact that we don't have access to some of the resources that we need, the Narcan, things like that, on a 24-hour basis is contributing to this crisis. And it was just an eye-opening moment for many people to be like, wow, we really need to be looking from a different lens, and we have the best intent, but sometimes we just don't see it from that perspective. And these conversations need to continue happening. So then from there, we went across the state all the way over to Kansas City. And in Kansas City, they had us in a community library, in a library where many people with lived experience living on the streets convene in this neighborhood and in this area. And we, again, no RSVPs. We put a sign outside the door. We had many people from the community come in. We had people from the state there. And one by one, people with lived experience that were in the library started finding their way into our room and just started joining. We had youth that were in the library that came and joined our conversation. So to have the opportunity, we had, I would guess the young man was maybe 10, and then maybe 13 and 16. There was 3 youth that joined us, and to have their voice in the conversation, to talk a little bit about some of their experiences that they experienced in their community, and a little bit in their homes, but not a lot there, but more about their community experience, along with all these adults and people that were, again, living on the streets, living in their cars, not in treatment, or have been in treatment, but have lost jobs as a result of it. And bringing all these people together. And one of the amazing things that happened, Steve, was about 3/4 of the way through, a gentleman came into the room. And I was not facilitating at this point, so I greeted him and gave him a bottle of water and asked him if he wanted to sit down. And actually his comment to me was, is there somebody here that can help me get into treatment? And I was able to find one of the providers who stepped out into the library area, made some phone calls, and within 15 minutes found a place for this gentleman to go find the help that he was seeking. So not only were we creating recommendations on what the state should do to combat this overdose crisis, but also really serving the needs of the people in the moment.
One of the things that impressed me, and I've been in prevention 15 years and done a lot of special events or one-time events or community engagement kind of things, and not always are they tremendously successful. A lot of times they don't meet even the basic expectation. That was different with this. You've kind of illustrated that in St. Louis, Poplar Bluff, and in Kansas City, not knowing who would show up every time, I think it exceeded anybody's expectations. And I kind of shared that with the group in Kansas City to have this number of people show up. And what's interesting is it was in the middle of the day, in the middle of the week, and people were still standing behind that. So I'm kind of curious from your perspective. Now, you lead your own company, Empowering You, and you've kind of talked a little bit about what you do. But from that lens, kind of let's say from the outside looking in, what do you think that says about what's going on, through the lens that you operate from? What do you think that people showing up and being engaged and really feeling like they can lend their voice to this process? What do you think that says?
Yeah, I think that says that people care, that people see that this is a concern and an issue, and they want to improve the lives of their neighbors, their friends, and their community members. But from the lens of somebody who does community engagement, Jubilee Church was set up for many people. They were great. It was fantastic, and we pushed them to the edges. But both in Poplar Bluff and in Kansas City, we kept having to pull chairs out. We as facilitators were not prepared for the number of people that came filtering in the room, because in my experience, if you can get 20 or 30 people into a room when it relates to community engagement, like that's a success. And here we were having 60, 70, 50, 30, and the numbers just kept exceeding what is kind of what you plan for or think about. So I think for me, it says a couple of things. It says, one, that people really care. This issue is something that people want to get behind and do something about. It also says that for whatever reason, people feel like their voices can be heard across the state of Missouri, and that they feel like if they give their time, that it's not going to fall on deaf ears and that it is going to move forward. So kudos to the state of Missouri and other people and organizations who have been doing listening sessions and reaching out to community members, because there's a message across the state of Missouri that your voice matters. And I think that's absolutely fantastic and so needed and so just respectful of everybody. Because at the end of the day, everybody wants to have their voice have meaning. But I think the state of Missouri is feeling that.
You're listening to Prevention Perk. A podcast is like a breakout session from your daily routine. It's a unique way to perk up your prevention efforts. We'd like to hear from you. Please send your comment, topic, or guest suggestion to midamericapttc@gmail.com. Let's talk a little bit about the work that you actually do. So we've used the term like participatory engagement. So can you help us understand what exactly are like the tools of engagement? What does that mean? How's that fit into the prevention work or community work, or even an organization if they're a nonprofit? How does all these terms fit into what we're trying to do primarily in the prevention field?
Yeah. So participatory engagement really means, at the core, to me, what it means to me is that all voices are heard and all diverse perspectives are honored. And honored does not mean that we are pushing to change people's opinions or make everybody think something that they don't want to. It means that we create space to recognize that we all have different experiences, different associations, different memories. We were raised differently. We worked in different organizations, and that we think differently than one another. And how do we create space where all of those perspectives are honored, heard, listened to, and then collectively people create something bigger than they can ever create by themselves? in through that awareness that your lens is just slightly different from somebody else's lens. So at the core of what I do, that's what I want. I want to make sure that everybody's voice is heard and that we are creating space for all the diverse perspectives without judgment so that we can then take and figure out what to do, whether it's creating better meetings so people show up. I think about coalition meetings and how hard it is to get people to, they're volunteering their time and energy. And how can we help people create meetings where at every meeting people's voices are heard or they're co-creating something together? How do we create plans? Another part of coalition work is getting people to really volunteer to do the work. And the work is hard. Sometimes it's nice to talk about it and plan it, but you get to the work, that's tough. But how can you create plans that have detailed tasks on a calendar so people can say, you know what, I can't commit to the 9 months, but I can commit to the 30 days that it would take to finish this task or to complete this effort. And finding different ways and different places for people to step into projects so that work isn't always on the coalition leaders or the staff directed by the coalition, but the coalition members really lean into the areas that matter to them where they have passion. So how can you help create that space for them? So at the end of the day, that's what my hope is through my work and my organization, is to give people tools and processes and methods so they can help bring people to the table based on the passion that that individual has or their why. Why is it important for them? Also helping different sectors or communities or organizations understand how they fit in this bigger picture of the crisis, the in this case, the overdose crisis, or just in any prevention work that's happening. But that is the drive, is really to give people the tools and the skills to be able to actually move community change.
So we've talked a lot about, what you did here in Missouri. And as you were kind of talking about some of the work that Empowering You does, I'm thinking that you've also done some, just in the short period of time I've known you, some really interesting things. You did some work over, was it in Tennessee or Kentucky? I know you just came back from working with some tribal lands up in Alaska. And so, and they're all different, but they're somewhat all the same when you bring or you overlay these tools of engagement on them. But can you kind of give us a flavor for like some of the other projects you've worked on that maybe were a smaller scale or across an entire state?
Yeah, so we had the opportunity to work on the eastern side of Kentucky about almost 2 years ago now too. Wow, time just flies. But it was really to address the health and wellness of youth, where we embedded into Eastern Kentucky for several months. We did 52 focus groups across the east, across 5 counties in the eastern side of Kentucky. And then we did almost 5 weeks of strategic planning, where we went out and took the data that was gathered from all the strategic plan or from all the focus groups, also through surveys so that we could reach people. But we went into the hollers, we went into the areas where people don't necessarily even know how to read and write very well. But we went to the community to get their perspectives and their voices. And then we offered a strategic planning process, one element per week for 5 weeks to develop a 5 county strategic plan to address the health and wellness of youth moving forward. So that was a large project. I also had the opportunity to work with DJC Solutions to conduct interviews to address the DEC program and the drug endangered children and what it is about that program that is really key, so that a toolkit could be created around how can that one was Tennessee DEC, was around the state of Tennessee, and how that DEC program could, a toolkit could help other people or other states really embrace that program and understand the essence and the value of it and what they could do to increase the use of that program across the state. Then we did have some opportunities that were not directly related to coalition work, but we got the opportunity to go to Nome, Alaska and work with Alaskan Natives, people who feel like their traditions and their cultures are being run over or not valued. And so we got the opportunity to work with Native and non-Native Alaskans to talk about what does it mean to co-create and to live in the space. And when I think about that, there's such a direct coalition or a direct connection going back to coalition work. How do we co-create and how do we live in this space, regardless of what the coalition's aim or strive is? There's people that are in addiction, and there's people that are have recovered from addiction, and there's people who've never been in addiction at all. And how do we co-create together to understand that we can collectively address this issue from multiple lenses? The last one that you mentioned was working up in Canada, where we got an opportunity to work with Native American experts from across the state of or country of Canada to address some inequities that are happening with their with the way information is portrayed in their arts and museums. So there are different dialects, there are different opinions, there are different ways that people honor and respect. And so we're working with a group up there who has a grant to address this issue across the country. And again, brings it right back to that coalition space. We all have different ideas, different opinions, different dialects, different ways that we live across the country. What works in one area doesn't work in another. What works in one organization doesn't work in another. And how is it that we help people come together to see where the commonality is and where it is that we can work together to make those improvements? So it doesn't, whether you work in a coalition or an organization or a government structure or a Fortune 500 company, it is about trying to figure out how to work together to do something that can last a little longer, that really takes all of the different perspectives into consideration so that no one area, organization, or set of people are negatively impacted because their perspective was not considered.
Well, we've talked about kind of a larger project, so state, even national, I guess. I want to bring it a little bit down to a smaller scale. I'm not an expert yet. I'm intrigued. I'm learning a lot about participatory engagement. But I approached you and Dave Clausen about an idea where we might bring some of these tools into the realm of professional development and help individuals really kind of develop their own understanding of what is their leadership style, not what I read out of a book or saw at a seminar or just learned from, an internet or a YouTube video, but how do I dig that out from the inside out? And this is evolved into doing this through storytelling. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what that process is like, because I was sitting here thinking it's new for me. It's vulnerable to take on that role of really being the facilitator. And then you're coming from the other side where you have that mastered, but you aren't really skilled in the storytelling aspect. And that's kind of where we met in the middle, because I've always been intrigued with storytelling. And so this is kind of an organic thing that came out of it, that maybe we can help others to find a story to tell about who they are and how they lead. And can you talk a little bit about what that looks like?
Yeah, I was really excited when you approached me with this idea and this concept for a couple of reasons. One is because when I think about leadership and what does it means to be a leader, I look at it from the lens of anybody who's trying to move change, anybody who's trying to lead a meeting, lead a coalition, lead an effort, drive a program, anything. It puts them in a position of leadership. And those are leaders. Those are people who want to bring people together to do something better. And so, yes, there's hierarchical leaders, but that's not my frame. That's not my frame when I facilitate. It's not my frame when I teach these methods. The second side of that is I am somebody who grew into leadership in a very different way. If you knew me 15 years ago, 20 years ago, you wouldn't recognize the person that I am today. I come from a place of, to be completely vulnerable, low self-esteem, low belief in myself. And it wasn't because anybody told me bad things, and it wasn't because I was raised, I had a beautiful home, was raised in a middle-class family. I had all the opportunities, but there was something about self-talk and about the way that I looked at myself that didn't have me drive leadership from the traditional standpoint. I do have my master's degree. I have gone on to do my education, but I really believe that my leadership comes from non-traditional forms of leadership. And you asking me to be a part of this, to tell my story, is very scary and challenging because the vulnerability in that. I don't mind being vulnerable, but I am great at telling people why hearing voices and perspectives matters, but I'm not the one that's usually talking. I'm usually the one that's guiding and encouraging and helping people find that brave space. And what you're doing is pushing me into that brave space of my own. So I'm excited to tell my story, excited to talk about how leadership doesn't come from traditional forms. Your story that you're talking through and the power of creativity. And then Dave Clausen's story around how it shifted his career and the work that he does today based on the values that he has for himself through his own leadership journey is, I think they're all different, but they're all related. And I'm really hoping that our stories can help people figure out what their story is. What's their model of leadership that is the one that has been crafted over their lifetime for themselves. So I'm really excited to have the opportunity to be a part of this and see where it goes and how it might help others who maybe don't think that the traditional path is for them, and therefore maybe they feel they don't fit. And I want to push against that and say, absolutely, you do fit. We all have a place, and there is no one way to get there.
I'm hoping that you can help me remember this correctly. So I'm currently involved in the mastery program for the top. And it starts out, I think it's maybe even in that first session when we all got together, and it talks about where the engagement strategies started and through ICA and even before that. And one of the things that really got my attention was they talked about how it's kind of is centered in an art or an art form, or that this is really artistic. And of course, that's where my background comes from, but it also has an emphasis, which I think a lot of people don't understand, even going through the engagement aspect and some of the things you've talked about. There really is a story to all of this, and it's the individual story. And I was impressed with, if I'm remembering it right, it's like when I remember thinking, they're really speaking my language here. This really is about coming from that artistic lens and that need to tell either the persons, the organizations, the communities, whatever that looks like, story, and getting it out there for everybody to kind of embrace and live and move to the next level. Am I kind of making that up as I go along, but in a sense?
No, you've got it. So the technology of participation are the methods, the facilitation methods that I was first introduced to. That really is the underpin to most of my life's work. I used to say facilitation is something I did. I now tell people that it's a way I think. It's a way I engage with people. It's the way I talk to my family. It's the way I make small talk in the community. It's the way that I help organizations. But with that, the technology of participation the trademark holder of that is the Institute of Cultural Affairs. And back in the 50s and 60s, when the Institute of Cultural Affairs had staff, they went out into communities all across the world, into third world communities, any place that needed help figuring out how to improve their village or their community in some way. Well, these people might not have spoken the same language, or they didn't know how to read and write. And so you're right in the fact that it started in creativity. People started to remember things through song. They started to share a commonality through creating lyrics or drawing pictures. And eventually, right, as different communities developed, the reading and the writing came along with it. But it's always through the Institute of Cultural Affairs had a lens of creativity and artistic, that left and right brain kind of coming together. And so you're right, it's all grounded in community. Today, you don't see that as much. A lot of organizations, a lot of people still, they get a little uncomfortable when you get a little too much into the kumbaya. But it is still there and it's still possible. And there are still groups that do it, going all the way back, Steve, to our very first conversation where we talked about that strategic plan. And that moment of game changer moment, that was done through a creative expression activity. So it was acted out in a form of creativity that got people to see what words did not express or didn't land in the same way. So it is still maybe not used as much as it was originally, but it is still important to make sure that we're embracing the left and the right brain, because as you know, pictures say 1,000 words. And if you can act something out for 30 seconds or a minute, it can tell a story that you can read in a book.
You're listening to Prevention Perk. The National Academy for State Health Policy has posted a blog titled Engaging the People with Lived Experience in Opioid Settlement Decision-Making. This resource discusses the importance of empowering leaders with lived experience, engaging them at all levels of the process, address barriers to participation, and cultural humility. Plus, they provide a list of resources to learn more about working with people with lived experience. There is a link in our show notes. This has been a fascinating conversation. Before we come to a close, I always like to give the guest the opportunity to be the sage on the stage. So it's your opportunity, Stephanie. Is there something that as we've unpacked this, that maybe you've thought, gosh, I'd like to really talk about this, or I want to make sure that whoever's listening understands that? So I'll give you the final thought.
The thing that comes to my mind is just the fact that everybody wants to have a voice at the table. Everybody wants to be heard, and everybody wants to be seen. Not everybody has to have their way, but they do want to contribute to the bigger part of the conversation. So if you're working with people in any form or fashion, find a way to make sure that you're creating space for all voices to be heard. And all voices being heard is not always in a large group, outward focused way. Some people want to write their thoughts down. Some people want to work in small groups. Some people want to contribute anonymously. And some people like to talk to as many people as possible. So if you can take that into consideration and adjust the way you lead people through any sort of meeting by breaking things up and creating opportunities, I think you're going to see that the contribution that you get from individuals is going to look very different. And I think that's what the story at the end of the day is: create spaces for all voices, honor all perspectives, and let everybody feel heard.
My guest on this episode has been Stephanie Ahles. You'll find some links in our show notes to connect with her. Thank you, Stephanie, for being here.
Thank you for having me today.
And thank you for listening to Prevention Perk, a podcast from Mid-America PTTC. To learn more about our innovations, visit pttcnetwork.org and look under Your PTTC for the Mid-America link. Remember, prevention is better together, and together we are stronger.